Uh, Before we begin, about Bill, Bill's a veteran of the labor movement and a seasoned activist and strategist who's worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the National AFL-CIO. He's the former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and leads several other projects, one of which I will mention at the end. He is the co-author of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1941. The co-author of a book I highly recommend as I am currently reading it right now, Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, which will really orient you to trade unionism and the state of unions in the United States. And the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. Bill's a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator on television, radio, and the web. And most recently, he co-founded Standing for Democracy.org. That's standing the number 4 democracy.org and the U.S. Campaign for Western Sahara. And he is a writer of fiction and nonfiction. Bill, on behalf of the center, welcome. It's an honor to have you.
Thomas, Chica, thank you both very much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this discussion. And as you said, all of this is very timely.
Yeah, Bill, thank you so much for being with us. We've also been greatly looking forward to this. It's been great the couple of times that we've talked with you before. And let's just dive right in. So, the moment that we're living in, we are not quite 10 months into the second Trump administration. We are hearing all kinds of terms. I'm curious how you read the situation. Are we in a moment of fascism, rising fascism? Is this an authoritarian takeover? Is this instead just sort of an intensification of class war under capitalism? Like, what do you think about the terms? And does it matter which terms we use to discuss this moment?
Terms matter, um, absolutely. But it's understanding the nature of the moment that is critical. And sometimes terms get in the way when people become very frozen in the way that they look at things. We are in a moment that the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci described as where the old is dying, but the new is not quite ready to be born. And so we're in this interregnum. And interregnums are very dangerous because the old is trying desperately to hold on. And it is doing that through relying on, in this case, a social movement, a fascist social movement. And I think it's really important that people understand that we have had in the United States since the United States was founded, if not even before, various kinds of right-wing movements, very extreme right-wing movements. But what we've been witnessing over the last several years is a coalescing of these movements into something that now I think can be appropriately defined as fascist. That is, it is radical. It is saying we will dispense with the old way of doing things. It is authoritarian. We will get rid of even the pretense of democracy. It is deeply racist, incredibly sexist, misogynist, militaristic, and irrationalist. It is a movement that, much like other forms of right-wing populism, sees the future in the past. And in this case, what's really interesting that distinguishes the kind of neo-fascism of this moment from 20th century fascism of the 1920s to 40s is that they're not even making a pretense of improving humanity or of creating a new person. They are looking to return to something, to a mythological period, 1953, if not 1853. And so this is a very dangerous period. And this, what distinguishes this also is that this movement is has an armed wing, and an armed wing that sees itself very much aligned with the president and wishes to provoke a war. So that's what we're up against, and that may sound overwhelming, but as stupid as this may sound, I'm very confident we can defeat them. But it's going to take a very different way of thinking.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that you've got confidence. Could you say more about what that different way of thinking will be?
When you go up against an opponent that is better equipped, has more resources than you do not fight them on their terms. It's called asymmetric warfare. You fight them on terms that are advantageous to you. And so we should dispel with the idea, for example, that we will have a media outlet that's comparable to Fox News and scale, resource. It's not going to happen. And it shouldn't be surprising, because the oppressed never have more resources than the oppressor. Give us a time in history, and we can go back to Jesus, right? And give us a time in history when the oppressed had more resources than the oppressor. Won't find it. So the oppressed always have to figure out other means of subverting the oppressor. And so like in this current moment, the other side, I'm going to refer to them just as MAGA, as a fascist movement, developed a very brilliant approach, which was the Blitzkrieg, which the Nazis used militarily. And it was, their interpretation was flooding the swamp. And the best way to think about it is the name of that Academy Award winning movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. Right? That was their strategy. The problem for our side is that many of our organizations tried to respond everywhere, everything, all at once. And you can't do it. You just can't. It won't work. And so what we have to be doing is identifying the vulnerabilities of the other side. Thus, everyone watching should be reading Sun Tzu, The Art of War, to start thinking about strategy and tactics. And I would say, if you don't read Sun Tzu, you're not serious about winning. And you want to lose with dignity, but you don't want to win. So we have to study this and understand strategy and tactics, and understand that you got to find the vulnerabilities of the other side. So I'll give you an example. When the fires were taking place in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles area, Trump and the Republicans were making the argument that California would get no aid until it kneeled in front of the altar of Donald Trump. And they made fun of Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom. And fortunately, both Bass and Newsom told Trump, in effect, to go to hell. But that wasn't enough. What was needed was, around the country, there needed to be mass pressure on all federal elected officials, basically saying that California and the southeast of the United States, which had just been victimized by a hurricane, need to have unconditional aid to rebuild, not conditioned on kneeling before Caligula, right? Unconditional aid. That didn't happen, Chica. And I actually went to some environmental groups and I said, hey, this is our moment, right? Let's kick their ass. And people said, well, Bill, we're going to lobby in Washington, And oh, in my organization, well, it's a good idea, Bill, but we got other priorities and right. And it's like, in other words, you want to lose. I mean, that's what you want to lose. Instead of seizing the moment when we could have been talking to the entire country about environmental catastrophe and the destruction of the social safety net, you want to tell me you want to go lobby in Washington. That's what I mean. It's like we've got to start thinking like winners as opposed to victims. And that's part of how we will defeat the other side. I talk about what the military uses the term theaters of operation. In other words, that you have different areas where you're concentrating, and the people that are anchoring that work, what they wake up thinking about is that theater of operation, like the environment. Or another example is history. The right wing is attacking history. They're doing it ideologically and practically. They're doing ideologically with the attack on DEI. They're doing it practically with the attack on the Smithsonian. Now, there are a number of groups and some, particularly lawyers, that have been trying to mobilize around that, but there has been nothing approaching a mass campaign that turns it on its head. That's a theater of operation. So that's what I'm saying. We've got to think differently about how to take on the other side.
Yeah, and in your response, I hear maybe something about mass movement as being separate from the entrenched organizations. And would you say that that's an important piece as, mass mobilization, even
Yes.
outside of being organized into, nonprofits and so on?
So mass movements come and go. We often use the term very loosely. So we'll talk about the Black freedom movement. And that's useful in describing an amalgam of organizations and individuals committed to Black freedom. But that movement goes up and down, up and down. It's never linear. It's never really stable because mass movements are very unstable. And movements are built over time through combination of spontaneous eruptions, campaigns, etc. Organizations can help to advance mass movements. They can help to consolidate many of the gains of a mass movement, but they can't replace one. So when the Black freedom movement started to decline in the 1970s, it wasn't something that one organization, for example, could simply turn around. It was declining because of repression. It was declining because of victories, believe it or not, that we had won things and many people thought, okay, it's over. It was declining also because of reaching a strategic plateau and this question of where do we go next? And much of the leadership was very unclear about that. So we've got to be building organizations that help mass movements to reemerge, and in some cases to grow from scratch.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, we have today our conversation is on the theme of united fronts, coalitions, alliances. And I wonder if you can talk about, the MAGA movement that you named earlier. Like, who is it that we're naming we need to ally against or, create a united front against? Who is MAGA and what's the nature of this enemy?
Well, let me answer that by first identifying some terms or clarifying some terms and then get into that.
Yeah.
So when we talk about coalitions, alliances, united fronts, sometimes people think it's all the same. It's not quite. Alliances and coalitions are more or less the same. It's the unity of usually organizations, in some cases, social movements around tactical or strategic objectives. Coalitions and alliances can be very tactical. It can be about fighting a particular battle, and that's it. It also can be longer term. United fronts was a term that became very popular in the communist and socialist movements of the 1920s in referring to uniting the working class against the attacks from the capitalists. And it sometimes meant the uniting of organizations like the Communist and Socialist Party, Social Democrats, or whatever, or it could also mean uniting the members of those parties. But in Asia, particularly, the notion of a united front took on much broader meaning, that it wasn't just the working class, it was uniting forces in opposition to a particular oppressor, invader, etc. And so that term ended up having that's a term that many of us adopted in the United States, looking at the United Fronts as broad coalitions that could have a tactical or strategic objective. Now, MAGA. So MAGA's roots have to be understood as going back to the late 1960s. There's always been right-wing movements in the United States, but in the aftermath of the defeat of Barry Goldwater in '64 in the presidential election, some of his key people began to rethink what is the route to power. And these are the people like Paul Weyrich and Richard Viguerie that essentially started to lay out the idea of what came to be known as the New Right. And they saw this, and this was added to later by Lewis Powell in his the ultimately Supreme Court justice in his memo of 1971, I believe, or 73, that talked about the right reorganizing, in part because at least Lewis Powell, feared the growth of the left. But for Viguerie and Weyrich, they were looking at an approach to winning power. And they saw this as a multi-decade struggle. And they were quite brilliant. And they understood the importance of creating right-wing organizations like the National Conservative Political Action Committee, the creation of think tanks, Heritage Foundation. They understood the importance of right-wing social movements as a farm from which to harvest possibilities. So the anti-busing movement, anti-abortion, anti-Panama Canal Treaty, et cetera. These became very, very important. And as I always say, the right was much better than the left in terms of understanding a low bar for entry into those movements. So that litigation against liberal and progressive legislation, the training of people to run for office, and then ultimately the reaching out and cultivating a relationship with those who would later be identified as white Christian nationalists. And so you started to see this coming together, first in the support for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and then growing over time. Now, when the Cold War ended, one of the things that happened that was really important was that much of the way that the ruling elites in this country thought about running the world and running this country was now up for grabs. So you had almost immediately a change in the tone from segments of the Republican Party. The 92 presidential election, and you had a combination of Ross Perot running as an independent, but as essentially a right-wing populist in a certain way.
Mhm.
You had I always blank on his name, who also ran ran for the Republican nomination and failed. And then what was interesting was that the change of the rhetoric, there was something going on that was different. It didn't feel quite mainstream Republican. And then in '94, you had Newt Gingrich and the contract with America, where you hear the language of war from them, that they're not talking about bipartisanship. They're talking basically about war. And then increasingly turning a blind eye to more extreme elements within the right. You could see this during the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations, where there was the Republicans did not want to talk about right-wing extremists. They poo-pooed that even after the Oklahoma City massacre. So this movement starts to come together. It starts to articulate a growing worldview that is grounded in conspiracy theories, a kind of crypto anti-Semitism, in some cases overt anti-Semitism, a growth of xenophobia, and other forms of racism. The trigger for the next stage in the growth was the election of Barack Obama. Because once Obama is elected, the right wing says, oh my God, right? This is not supposed to happen. How does a Black man become the president of the white republic? That is not supposed to happen. And so the failure of the Obama administration to move quickly to both address the financial collapse, but also to counter the right, opened the space for the Tea Party movement, which was really a movement. It wasn't what, like some people talked about it being astroturf. It wasn't astroturf. It was maybe funded in many cases by right-wing billionaires, but it wasn't astroturf. It was really, they had a base. And so you start to see that. Then you end up having the birthers and the authors.
Yeah.
And that laid the foundation for Donald Trump and the Caligula administration, which is what we're living through now. And now, Chica, it's not just an amorphous group of folks, right? They've consolidated as MAGA with a set of views about what should happen to the United States.
Mhm.
And do you think any parts of this coalition that is MAGA can be like peeled off? Or how do you consider what it means to face this enemy? Like, is it, do we write them off as racists and white nationalists, and or is there some program that could, I don't know, or is it even strategic to think in such a way about a program to win back some of the folks who went over to the MAGA side in recent years?
I think you have to distinguish, and this is where you have to be very careful.
Okay.
You have to distinguish between the hardcore MAGA and the occasional MAGA voter.
Mhm.
So historically speaking, 25 to 30% of the US electorate is worthless. They are. I know some people are going to say, oh, Bill, that's horrible. You shouldn't. No, it's actually true. They're zombies. They've lost their humanity.
These are the diehards, you would say?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay.
And you can see it from election to election, and I would say, particularly if you're thinking about this, for example, by analogy with union organizing, you go into a non-union workplace, and one of the things that you have to figure out immediately is like, where are the workers? Where do they stand on things? And many of us use a scale like 1 to 4. Sometimes people do 5, right? So like, let's just say 1 to 4. 1 is pro-union, ready to be active. 2, pro-union, inconsistently active. 3, on the fence. 4, anti-union. You don't spend time with the 4s. Even if you like them, you don't spend time with them, because part of the problem is when people spend time with the 4s, and it's been proven over and again, it often energizes the 4s. 4s get really, they feel like, oh, I got to mobilize, right? We want to neutralize them.
Mhm.
The same in the electoral thing. We want to neutralize the MAGA folks. The hardcore MAGA, the people that really believe this nonsense, who might be very nice. They might be your neighbors. They might even be family members. And I'm speaking from personal experience, Chica.
Sure.
You just leave them alone.
Mm.
There is nothing to be gained with debating them. But that means you have to make a concrete analysis of whether they really are on the fence or whether they're hardcore and they're just playing a game with you.
Okay.
Winning over the people in the middle is going to depend to a great extent on us consolidating progressives.
Mhm.
So we need to have a platform that we're fighting for that inspires what I call the anti-fascist consensus. The platform, and this is what the late Jack Odell was trying to promote 20 years ago with his democracy charter, that we need, like what the Panthers had, a 10-point program, right?
Yeah.
And this is what we want, this is what we believe, this is what we're fighting for. And it's not about writing a book about all this stuff, although some people can, but it's like turning the idea of a third Reconstruction into what are the 10 or 20 things that we're fighting for? And we go to the people of the United States and say, this is our vision for a post-neoliberal, post-Trump world. And we want to engage with you on this platform because maybe we're missing something. What do you think about it, right? That's part of the building the core. And for us on the left, we have to be making sure that progressives do that.
Yeah.
So I use the metaphor of skins of the onion. The outer skin is the anti-fascist consensus. The next skin is the progressives. The next skin is the socialist left. And we on the socialist left have to be prepared to be vehemently anti-sectarian. We have to embrace United Front politics. We need to be proponents of the platform for a progressive United States. And ultimately, for us on the left, we want something beyond that. We want a socialist United States. But our immediate fight is not for that. So these are all the components that are necessary to beat back the right. And we've got to do it as a story. So yes, we have a 10, 20-point program, all that, right? But what the right is good at is that they create stories. So I'll tell you the right-wing story, one of their stories. Right-wing story is, once upon a time, if you worked hard, you did well, particularly if you were white, particularly if you were a male. That's the asterisk, the 2 asterisks, right? So you work hard, you do better. And the life for your children will always be better than yours.
Yeah.
And then you got screwed. And you got screwed because Jews manipulated African Americans, and they convinced liberal Democrats to open up the gates to bring in more immigrants, because what we need to do is change the demographic context of the United States, and da da da. That's one of the stories. But see, what the right does is that they morph the story a little bit. So if they're talking to Jews, they're not going to talk about conspiracy theories that focus on Jews being at the heart of it, right? But they will rely on anti-Semitism, racism, sexism. They'll talk, I mean, the whole focus on trans kids. It's like, you're telling me you're losing your job because of a trans kid? Is that what you're telling me? That the economy is collapsing because somebody that's trans wants to run in a different race? Is that actually you're telling me? You're telling me that, right? And so on and so forth. The normalization of bullying and victimization, all of this becomes part of their story. So we on the left side of the aisle need to have our own story. And that begins with a very different history of the United States. And that's what we got to be looking at. We've got to make these points, but we got to tell a story that's compelling.
Bill, I'm wondering, since you defined it, if we could go back to this definition of united fronts, because I think what this current period has done is it's really sharpened an understanding of what we're against, right? And it's created, the degree to which MAGA intensifies cutting SNAP benefits, violence in the streets against immigrants. It's clear that more and more people, and maybe we can talk about this when we talk about the election results from last night, are identifying with, that's not us. We're against this. But and I think you've written about this, other folks have written about this, and I think one of the comments in the chat, in the Q&A, is about, on the left, in the progressive bloc, right, there is still difficulty with understanding how to move together in a collective project when people have differences, political differences, differences in tactical approaches. I'm wondering if you can actually ground us in an understanding of, like, how would you define what united front politics should mean for us in this moment? I appreciated you talking about the differences and how that definition was expanded in Asia. And then if there are historical examples that are most relevant to us in the United States that either are recent or longer term.
So I think it's important, Thomas, to get away from myths about movements and about struggles. People are never all going in the same direction. There's always contradictions, within movements and within organizations. There's the whole myth of the civil rights movement is just ridiculous. I mean, you'd think that everyone was marching in line, right? And everybody and their grandmother was at the March on Washington, right, in '63. No, right? What's important to understand is that you do your best to build up a critical mass around a certain approach and a certain platform, recognizing that there will continue to be differences. For example, in the Vietnam War, there was a very broad united front called the anti-war movement, right? But within that movement, the differences were very significant in many cases about who to ally with, civil disobedience versus not, tactical differences, all these things. And you have to appreciate that. The critical thing, Thomas, is that we approach the differences as non-antagonistic. That we will have differences, but that those differences don't make one or the other side enemies. For example, I was accused last year, because I'm very pro-Ukrainian and against the Russian invasion, I was accused by someone who will go nameless of being the enemy.
Mhm.
Right? Now, I pointed out to this person and they didn't respond to me that using terms like that is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Because I remember COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. I know how using terms like that can lead to some very, very ugly scenarios. We can have differences, in fact, very strong differences. And where those differences make it impossible for us to work together, then the best thing is for us not to work together.
Mhm.
But where we can, what we should be trying to do is to determine, are there certain things where we can actually collaborate, even if we disagree on a lot of other stuff? And that's what I think the left should bring to the equation.
Mhm.
The problem is within the left, we have a lot of sectarianism and purism. And
Yeah.
that undermines the ability to win. And so that's sort of the approach that I take. Now, I may have forgotten the last part of your question, so remind me if I did.
Just if there are I mean, you've given some concrete examples with the Vietnam War, but if you think that
Yeah.
there are other examples, particularly, Bill, also just thinking about the assessment that's sometimes made offhand, right, which is that the left in the US is weak, and it's not always kind of concrete about where it's weak. And then if we are engaging in United Front politics right now, what are the points of contact? Is it grassroots base building organizations? Is it the trade unions? Like, what are the institutions you think are most important to kind of form the infrastructure of a united front? And how might that compare to other political geographies in which united front politics have been effective?
So let me answer that by going backwards. First, when I use the term left, I don't mean Bill Clinton. I don't mean Barack Obama. Right? Contrary to what you'll see on the television, right? Say, oh, James Carville. No. The left, I would identify are forces that are anti-capitalist, that believe that one way or another, capitalism is antithetical to the future of humanity. Progressives are much broader, but include the left. And progressives, generally, a progressive program focuses around structural reform, pushing the envelope on democracy, expanding democracy. And so the left needs to be part of that. The left in the United States at certain points has been quite strong, but it has also fallen victim to immense repression and incredible sectarianism. But generally speaking, we punch above our weight. So I'll give you an example. The health and safety movement, the occupational health and safety movement, most people have no idea where that came from, but it actually came from leftists that were working in workplaces that were building health and safety committees and ultimately built committees on occupational safety and health in different states, right? That was the left. The left will never get credit for that. That was the left. If you look at the critical forces in the anti-Vietnam War movement, it was not the liberals, it was the left. Now, we couldn't have done it by ourselves. Absolutely. But it was the left that was at the core. And so we sometimes downplay our own abilities. But the problem that we end up having all too often is one of purism. And I would say that is one of the main things that undermines our ability to win. When people believe that compromise in and of itself is unprincipled, when people believe that the maximum program is what we have to stand on, and that we can't modify that at different critical moments. The failure to identify the differences among our enemies. So, for instance, Liz Cheney is not at all a strategic ally of anybody on the left. However, she took a very strong and courageous stand against MAGA. So, what do? Do we ignore her? Do we write her off? Or do we say on those limited terms, we can work together? That's what much of the left has difficulty doing. Now, there's great examples of in the 1930s in the United States, the movement around the opposition to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia was a united front. The left was very much involved in it. Both the Communist Party as well as independent Black leftists, very central to that. The work around supporting the Spanish Republic against the fascists, again, it was all part of a broad front that brought a whole set of folks ranging from communists, Trotskyists, anarcho-syndicalists, et cetera, together, right? The communists blew it in 1939 when it went along with the so-called Hitler-Stalin Pact, but then tried to regain, and to a great extent did regain in 1941 and pressed the whole building the broad front. Very important examples. The civil rights movement, or the civil rights phase of the Black freedom movement, one could describe as a very successful united front that had a left, a right, and a center. And it was very uneven, but it worked for at least for a long time. The South African freedom movement also represented a very complicated broad front against apartheid, very complicated, because there were significant differences between the major organizations, the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, the Azanian People's Organization, the Black Consciousness Movement. They disagreed on a lot of things, but by and large did not go to war with one another. And at certain points were willing and able to collaborate. And that set the tone for much of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. Although true to form in the United States, sectarianism reared its ugly head, and you had pro-ANC people that were trying to trash pro-PAC people, and but we were successful. If you look overseas, also the response in South Korea to the attempt just recently at, in effect, the coup. Very broad front, labor movement played a central role in it. So there's many examples of that. Building and sustaining united fronts is hard work. And I'll tell you, Thomas, as someone who has regularly been involved in building coalitions, it's partly why I have gray hair and have lost hair on the back of my head.
Chick, I know we want to probably also talk about this, some of our inquiries about like the forms that we're talking about on the terrain right now. Wondering if one transition point might be talking about something that's central to your work, Bill, which is I've been proselytizing this to Chico to other people, like the value of solidarity divided, just in terms of like, and also this line that you have from one of your recent pieces about the importance of, or the future, the lack of a future for the labor movement without it being anti-fascist. And I think if we think about, the Germany of Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg, like the centrality of unions and workers' movements in periods of the fight against fascism, it doesn't necessarily feel like that's a total loss here, but it's not quite the same. And I'm wondering if you can situate folks who are listening in on like what you mean by that about this provocation to the labor movement of which you've been a part for a long period of time. That in order for it to have a future, it needs to be anti-fascist and by designation part of a united, like a central part of a united front.
Absolutely. So, what many people who are outside of the trade union movement fail to appreciate is that unions are themselves united fronts. They are not political organizations in the sense of you don't join them because of some set of principles of unity or ideology. People join them to improve their lives, for the most part. And that means that you're going to have people within a union that range from the left to the right, from atheists to fundamentalists, the whole 9 yards, men, women, every racial, ethnic group. That makes navigating unions much more complicated, certainly than navigating an NGO, but also navigating other organizations that people join voluntarily because of the principles of the organization. Now, that means that moving unions is more than getting the leadership to adopt certain resolutions. Actually, moving unions means educating the membership and winning the members over to a set of politics and directions. The easy route for many people, including on the left, is to try to unite people around common approach to economics. So you often hear from even good people that what we need to do to win, beat the right is economic populism, aggressive economic populism. And that if we have the right economic message, we'll win people. And that's not correct. And there's no historical basis to believe it. It's if you look at the victory of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, in the years immediately preceding those victories, trade union movements in both countries were militantly economic, but not anti-fascist. And we see where that took them. Mm. The threat from the far right is an existential threat to unions, despite the fact that you do have certain union leaders who will go nameless, who wish to collaborate with President Caligula and the MAGA movement. And they believe that they will save themselves by making such a collaboration. Again, it's a fool's errand. There's no basis to believe that. They may be the last ones that go into the gas chambers, but they're going in. And so the union as an institution of the working class represents a fundamental threat to the objectives of MAGA. When MAGA talks about the Republicans have become the working class party, it's BS. They're not the working class party. They don't have the interests of the working class in any way, shape, or form. They may have a certain set of white workers who are in their ranks, but they're not a working class party or working class organization. So in order to beat back this existential threat, the members of unions and their allies have to understand the nature of our enemy. Our enemy is not just President Caligula. It's not just the oligarchs. It's them plus a mass movement that represents a third of the population of the United States. And that means that also within our ranks in the union movement, there are MAGA supporters. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, we can ignore them. In other cases, we will have to do battle with them. But it means that the union has to stand for something. So the unions need to join in the fight for the third Reconstruction. They need to fight in terms of what does a post-neoliberal, post-Trump world look like? All of that is critical. And in the absence of that will be cream. And that's unfortunately what like when I've talked to union leaders and they'll say things like, Bill, yeah, I agree with your analysis, but man, we got MAGA voters within our
Mm,
ranks, and we got to be careful, right? And I'll say, yeah, okay, but I said, let me give you another example. In 1941, Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that opened up the war industry to the hiring of Black workers. And this was as a result of the demand from A. Philip Randolph and others. And from 1941 through 1945, there were these things that were called hate strikes that took place. These were wildcat racist strikes
mm,
by white workers against the employment of Blacks. Now, think about this for a second. The resolution of World War II was never certain until at least 1943 with the Battle of Stalingrad. So that meant you had these crazy white folks going on strike, undermining war production when the outcome of the war was not clear. Union leaders, with great courage, took a stand against the hate strikes. That meant taking a stand against your own members in many cases. I've told people that's the courage we need right now. To take a stand, even if, yeah, okay, so you have MAGA voters, that's fine. So you will continue to represent them on wages, hours, and working conditions, but you don't represent them by being neutral on the question of fascism. You
mm,
don't represent them by saying, well, that's a legitimate point of view. It's not up to me to say, no,
mm.
it is for you to say, this is not the direction that the working class needs to go. And so when I'm adamant, as you can tell, that the union movement needs to be anti-fascist, this is what it's grounded in.
Yeah,
There's no neutral ground.
this is great, Bill. I really appreciate you bringing us so many historical moments and examples to think about and learn from. And maybe shifting gears a little bit, I know we very much wanted to dial into some electoral politics thinking with you and understand, both what just happened yesterday, but maybe even we could start a little farther back with the 2024 election. And, there was so much, the presidential election, there was so much hype and talk about the need for a broad front for coalitional politics in that moment. And that seems to have been a failure. I wonder what we can learn. What would you say are some important lessons from, the Kamala Harris run and the failure to stop Trump's ascendancy this time around?
So, Shika, there's a number of things I would say, and I'd start further back.
Okay.
Um, so, one is that there needs to be an age limit on who runs for president.
Terrific. I'm with you on that.
Am I too subtle? Um, and that's one thing. The second thing over which we had no control is what I would call post-COVID traumatic syndrome.
Mm,
The COVID pandemic traumatized the people of the United States. Traumatized other people too, but I'm focusing on the United States. It traumatized people. And in the context of that trauma, all kinds of irrational stuff started floating. But there was also this thing that you could sense where people just wanted to forget about that period. Let's just get past it. And Biden and Harris reminded people of that era.
yeah.
So that's a second thing. The third thing was that Biden and Harris did not fight the Republicans at critical moments when there were extensions on various COVID benefits to the working class, particularly, that the Republicans were vaporizing.
Yeah.
And apparently because Biden Harris thought it was going to be a loser. But people needed fighters. They needed to see that Biden and Harris were actually going to fight. And then, of course, there was the Gaza debacle,
Yeah.
and the stance that Biden took, which was just unforgivable, and Harris's refusal to make a real break. So you had all of that. Then you add on to that Biden dropped away from the race with only 100 days left for Harris, which was remarkable. It was remarkable in some ways that she did so well. Mm-hmm. And then you have the issue of voter suppression, which I don't understand why more of the left isn't talking about it. Left and progressive movements are not talking about the extent of the voter suppression that we witnessed in 2024, with upwards of 3.5 million voters disenfranchised, overwhelmingly African American and Latino, and all kinds of things that were going on. So you've got all of that, and then you have the failure of Harris to develop a program that spoke sufficiently to the pain that people were going through. Because while it was true that the Biden administration had brought the country back from the brink of disaster because of the economic collapse, there was a continued denial that people were suffering, and that suffering, and here's the punchline, was not based on what happened between 2020 and 2024. It's what happened between 1973 and 2024. That is, the growth of neoliberal economics ate away like termites in a tree at the inner part of our reality. And it ate away and ate away and ate away until, while the outside of the tree may have looked strong, all it needed was a strong wind to come and knock it over. And that strong wind was the pandemic. And so by the time of the pandemic and its aftermath, people were basically saying, we've been screwed. And so then in that situation, the right-wing populism of Trump emerges. Now, there's another piece to this, which is really important, which is that the election was not simply about economics. If it was, then I think Harris would have won. Because if you look at the messages of the Trump campaign, they were cruel, they were racist, they were sexist, they were everything you can imagine. They were homophobic, and people voted for this guy anyway. I know I'm going on, but give me 1 second. There's this test I give to people. Whenever they talk about the economy, I say, okay, fine. So now, I want you to imagine the following scenario. Black man is running for president on a populist message and running against a white woman. And the Black man starts talking about the sexual behavior of that white woman. And the Black man's running mate either calls or implies that white woman is a whore. What do you think the election results would be? Now, I've raised this in many places, and there's no audience that has ever said, oh, the Black man would win. It's like, not only no, but hell no. And the question is whether the Black man would even be able to get to the election day, right? After something like that. Yet, Trump and Vance were ready to vilify in the worst possible terms Harris. And then you had people saying, well, I don't like him, but, it's about the economy. No, damn it. You know as well as I do, if a Black man had said any of that, he would have run him out of town on a rail. That's why it's not just about economics. It's about living in America.
Yeah. It's also you know, we just got out of this. We're just hours from last night, right? This incredible slate of elections.
Yes.
And one of the things, so Bill, you and I are from New York. Chica lives in New York. Well, all three of us were probably paying very close attention to the Mamdani race. We have some sense of what it means for someone like Mamdani to be the figure that takes over. You know, someone said to someone of our CP advisors said to us, you know, it's not lost on us that shouldn't be lost on us that Mamdani will be Muslim mayor will be the mayor for the 25th anniversary of 9/11 in New York, right? Like there's a lot that has changed since that period. And actually, one of the groups that means a lot to me that was a big part of Mamdani's early positioning in this election was Drum, the Issues Rising Up and Moving. And I was I was volunteering with their youth organizing program back in 2023. And I've always proselytized about how strong their organizing program is, but even this feels like what an incredible kind of feat that to win this election. And it also is a reminder that this didn't come out of nowhere. This is built over a long period of time. It was a lot of organizing that actually set the scene, even though the ground game was incredible. But the one thing that you mentioned this, and you were just you were saying it's not just about the economics, right? But I'm curious what you think is the role or how you see the relationship between the populist program that Mamdani and AOC and Bernie, who went on their oligarchy tour this year, what the role of that is in relationship to the program of the United Front. I know you in one of your pieces you alluded to, and I mentioned this before, the example of the New Popular Front in France in 2014, fighting on both ends of that. You also referenced the Third Reconstruction. I'm wondering if you can flesh that out a little bit more and help us understand what the significance of these victories, electoral victories, are, the significance of a developing class consciousness and a deepening class consciousness around oligarchy, and the actual United Front program, which, you know, to Chika's question before, right? Like it feels like there was a lot that we weren't able to do to stop Trump to get into power, but now we're in a totally different phase when we're fighting fascism, full on, and in the streets.
So the election results nationally were amazing. I mean, to call it a sweep is an understatement. And despite the fact that the Speaker of the House was saying that this was of no significance to the Republican Party, either meant that he had just smoked some really good herb, or he was just he's lost his mind. And it's one or the other, right? Because it's obviously this is very damning. This was a massive refutation of MAGA. And in New York, as I was just reading this piece by this writer Eric Blanc, and he was talking about how when Mamdani announced, very few people took it seriously that he would win. I think what he was able to do was to personify several things, not just speaking to people's anger, but laying out some things that he thought that government could do well and needed to be done. I think he spoke against bigotry, and truly was the candidate of inclusiveness. in a way that almost certainly uh, could never have been. And he was of a younger generation and was basically saying that we're not going to return to the status quo. So, which is very important because it's not like he was hearkening back to a better era. He was basically saying we've got to go forward and we're essentially building a new city. And that was really compelling. Now, here's the punchline before we get into the second part of what you're raising about the oligarchy. If organization is not built at the base, and if Mamdani is not held accountable, and I don't mean the way ultra leftists often want to hold people accountable. The first thing that someone disagrees with, they're ready to throw a rock at them, right? This would be a failure. I was in South Africa once and a number of years back, and I met this guy from the landless workers movement. And Lula was the president at the time. This was in the second administration.
You're
And
talking about Brazil, in Brazil, yeah.
Israel, right. But I was in South Africa.
Oh, okay.
So the guy was visiting South Africa, right? So we were talking about Brazil, and I said something like, so do you all oppose Lula? He said, no. He said, our role is to remind Lula of everything that he promised to do and to push him. And I said, brilliant. That would never have occurred to anyone in the United States. Never. We don't think that way. We think, okay, sucker, you voted, you stood on these planks, we disagree with you on this one, therefore you're now an enemy of the class, right? As opposed to deciding, identifying what the balance of forces are, what is quite possible to do, and where pressure is needed. One of the mistakes when Obama was elected, and certainly Mamdani is to the left of Obama, but one of the mistakes that was made was this whole notion of you have to give the brother a chance, give him breathing room, right? And I was asked before he was elected, should there be a honeymoon period? And I said, absolutely. And people said, well, how long? I said, 24 hours. I said, 24 hours? I said, yeah. I said, I'm not joking. I said, let's party for 24 hours. And in the 25th hour, we need to kick his ass. We need to be right there, nose length behind him, so that he cannot turn around without running into us. I would say the same with regard to the mayor-elect. I love him. He comes from a great family. His father is brilliant. And this is someone I have great respect for, but he is an individual.
Yeah.
Without social forces pressuring there, right? Yeah. There's always the possibility of retreat. But I'm excited. I'm thrilled. I couldn't believe the news this morning. But Thomas, this thing you said about class consciousness and the oligarchy, you've got to be careful now. There's a difference between populist consciousness and class consciousness. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people who are really angry with the rich, and they see themselves as there's the rich and then there's the rest of us. Class consciousness is something else. Class consciousness is about understanding oppression and understanding that any act of oppression undermines the working class, and that the working class and its representatives can never believe that there can be what one of my late friends, Tyree Scott, would call a separate peace. There can never be a separate piece with capital. You can never say, all right, we'll let you get away with this homophobia, but don't come around racism, right? No,
Yeah.
it's like we've got to be taking a stand. And so the fact that people are angry with the oligarchs is good and it's a beginning, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have class consciousness. It means that they're anti-rich for now.
Mm,
And that's what I mean, anti-rich for now, because there's a lot of people in the United States that are anti-rich until they think that they can become rich. This
mm,
is one of the reasons that a lot of tax reform efforts fail. I mean, literally, I mean, this is no joke, that working class people will often vote against tax reform efforts because they have the illusion that at some point they
they're
too
gonna.
may become rich. Right. So even though they may despise the rich of today, an example of this is our vice president,
Mm.
right? I mean, basically, his opposition to the elite was based on they wouldn't let him in.
Mm,
It wasn't opposition to the existence of an elite. That's what we have to be very clear. Class
yeah.
consciousness says, no, we obliterate the elite,
Yeah.
right? There is no room in democracy for an elite. But people like Vance are saying, no, 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 please let me in. I will
Mhm.
be loyal. I just want to be let in. And so when he is left out, then he is, you know, attacking the elite.
Mm.
That's the distinction becomes very important, man.
It's such a sharp distinction, Bill, and it's so helpful. And Chica, we were just teaching our Marxism class, and already so many pieces that I wish we could have used in that class, non-antagonistic versus antagonistic
Absolutely.
contradictions, and
Yeah.
yeah, and then this clarity about class consciousness, because I do think that there will also be a lot of think pieces written about like the people not necessarily caught up in the moment, but trying to like calibrate how big Mamdani's win is, in particular because of like the class conscious language, the fact that he's a democratic socialist. And it's not to undersell it; it's certainly important. But I do think, he announced his transition team just a few hours ago. Like he's clearly um, trying his best to lay those steps out. And there's a lot of
Good.
people within his coalition that we know that are certainly going to hold him to the fire. But yeah, but it's still worth reiterating because of the past failures and Obama administration being one of them, where I would say, just as a side note, and I think as anybody from New York might appreciate, I did like his subtle use of the Cuomo "you campaign in poetry and govern in prose" line
Yeah.
in his speech last night. I did think that was a silent diss track that I appreciated very much.
I guess the other thing that's important is that the summation is already started. So
Yeah.
you've got people looking at all the elections, and the Democratic centrists are basically saying it proves that moderates, with the exception of Mamdani, are the future of the party.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we've got to push back and point out that we're seeing the anger of the people against MAGA.
Yeah.
Now, that anger can very easily dissipate if people feel let down.
Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. I think maybe we could close out by asking you, Bill, to talk a little bit more about a long range vision. How do you see how do you see this like defeat of MAGA looking? What does that look like in a country like the US that has this long history of far right extremism, racist movements, the normalization of oppression, and so on? You spoke a little bit about third reconstruction, democracy charter, and I saw in the Q&A a little bit of questioning around that. So if you want to talk about that, that'd be great.
To your question, Chica, I'm probably going to give a very unsatisfactory answer.
Okay.
Um, I've come to believe that um, there's two different notions of defeat. So the MAGA movement can be defeated maybe three ways. It can be defeated by itself if it finds itself embroiled in a civil war. Like when you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene taking on Trump, that's of great significance. And you have Steve Bannon, who despises Musk. These are things that could destroy the movement from within. A second thing is a longer term combination of electoral defeats as well as changing the dominant narrative in the United States. That includes reversing these notions around DEI. It means expanding democracy, etc. These are all contribute to their political defeat. But they will never go away entirely. The other part of the thing about defeat that I've thought a lot about is that history and life is not linear. And it's not one-dimensional. That history does not travel in a straight line. And the outcome is never inevitable, except for death. The outcome is never inevitable. Thus, when you have poetic sayings such as that of Martin Luther King, when he said the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, that's beautiful, except it's wrong. The arc of history is long, he's correct. It doesn't bend towards justice. It doesn't bend any particular way unless it is bending because of various social forces. And so you can think that you have crushed an enemy only for them to reemerge. It's just like at the realm of disease, right? The United States basically thought that it's wiped out polio. And then all of a sudden you have these idiots that say, well, we don't need vaccines. And all of a sudden you got polio again, right? The same is true politically. Life is about an ongoing struggle against evil. It's an ongoing struggle against oppression. It's that I don't see in my lifetime or for 1,000 years, the total victory, because we're talking about, in effect, creating new human beings with a completely different consciousness, morality, sense of purpose. One of my favorites, you may or may not know, I'm a real science fiction person and I love Star Trek. I mean, every Star Trek, the whole, everything. And one of my favorite of the the Star Trek films is the Star Trek 3, where they, I think it was 3. No, not 3. It was First Contact, Star Trek First Contact. So they go back from the 24th century to the 21st century. And so Captain Picard is taking Alfred Woodard, who's this person from Earth from the 21st century, around showing her the Enterprise. And she says something like, wow, how much did this cost? And he said, the economics of the 24th century are different from your own. The acquisition of wealth is not the driving force in human affairs. Mm. He said that, and I just screamed. I said, oh my God. Right? And it's like, yes, that's right. And that's our objective.
Yeah.
And it makes us more than another 2 or 3 centuries to get there.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that answer is beautiful and I'm not left unsatisfied by it at all. I also appreciate the movie recommendation. Certainly we'll be checking that out. Thank you, Bill.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
it's
especially the
great.
Picard reference. I'm a next generation kid as well. So,
Yeah.
but Bill, before we go, I know that you do have a project. Speaking of the maintenance of democracy and the ongoing work, do you want to talk a little bit about standing democracy as we close out and what that project is
Sure.
about?
Sure, it's Standing for Democracy, and as you said, it's standing then the number 4 democracy.org. And what this came out of, it's a worker-focused project that is aimed at taking on the far right. And it includes trade unions, but it includes groups that are not unions, that have workers, NGOs, mass organizations, et cetera. And what we are trying to do is promote education so that people understand the growth of the far right. We're trying to offer assistance to organizations that want to do that. And we're building local organizing committees of volunteers that are, interested in combating the right in whatever forms that takes, election defense, abortion clinic defense, fighting against attempts to squash books, you name it, self-defense. We have 2 in upstate New York. We have 1 in Seattle and 1 in St. Louis, and we want to expand even further. One of our objectives is to work to fight to get the trade union movement to become, in effect, an anti-fascist movement. But that's only one of our things. We are also reaching out to other movements, like the environmental movement, much of which has a base among workers. And we want to engage them in this whole anti-fascist struggle, and to see the importance of linking the fight around the attack on the social safety net and the environmental catastrophe. So critical at this point, Thomas, is the development of both a defensive and offensive strategy against MAGA. And we're pushing other organizations to really take that up and to not look at strategy as simply one demonstration after another.
That's great. That's very useful, Bill. Thank you so much for your time with us today and all the wisdom you've dropped on us. This has been an amazing conversation.
My pleasure and honor. Thank you very much for asking me.